702.
The Big Interview
With Bongani Bingwa.
All right, we were told just the other day that we've spent nearly 300 million rand repatriating foreign nationals. And the Border Management Authority says it's intercepted more than 4,200 undocumented people trying to enter South Africa between April and June alone. So as government intensifies a migration crackdown, we want to ask the all-important question: are we in fact solving the issue or paying millions to move people across borders only to see the same migration cycle begin again when they return? And who exactly is benefiting from this system? Who is it paying? And will the other governments that we've now asked to pay us back for bringing their people to them, will they actually do it? Dr. Rebecca Walker is a senior research consultant at the Africa Center for Migration and Society at Wits University. A pleasure as always to have you on the show. Thank you for your time.
Good morning to you and your listeners.
The numbers are staggering, almost 300 million rand with this latest crackdown. Almost 90,000 people have been repatriated. Is it evidence that our strategy is working, or, as I asked in my introduction, are we merely kicking the can down the road?
So, I think those are two very different things, right? So a strategy, when it's working, is that you're actually producing the outcome you're aiming for. So we need to ask, what were we aiming for? If it was to reduce unemployment, that's unchanged, if not worse. If it was a more orderly migration system, we have less of one than we had, before. We have burnt regional relationships. We've created our own crisis. We performed a crisis, in fact. There's no bilateral agreements that have been put in place. So government got very efficient at a particular operation, which was removing people. But whether that operation actually solved anything is a completely different question. And I think, that actually hasn't been answered. We should be asking why, 90,000 people were so-called repatriated, and why that's been framed as a headline success, because these are human beings, in many cases, who are working, raising families, embedded in communities and contributing to the economy. So, if we're measuring success by just the number of removals, then we really need to, look at, what problem were we trying to solve, and has it been solved? And that was never clearly defined. But all we have is the numbers that we've been given.
Doctor, but even if we focus on those numbers, are those numbers necessarily even telling the story we are told? Because do we have any data, for example, about how many people are repatriated to subsequently return to South Africa?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that of those people so-called repatriated, and I say so-called because repatriation is returning people when they want to go back to a place or they need to go back, and this wasn't repatriation. But we know that many of those people were actually documented in the first place. So this isn't an operation to deal with so-called illegal immigration. This was moving people who had been forcibly chased out of their communities with a budget that the government had never budgeted for, 5 times the actual, 60 million that they had put forward for deportations, and outside of the legislative framework.
Sorry, I just said and counting. 5 times and counting.
And counting, yes. Yeah, and I think another point to make is that 48 million was spent on a facility, a temporary repatriation centre designed for 20,000 people. And that peaks at just over 1,000 occupants at any one time. So who's accountable for that? Because if the operation is a sort of, a policy success on migration, then, you don't describe it as an unfunded mandate and then send other countries the bill for it, which is what we have done. So, we really need to ask, has anything changed other than, causing disruption in communities, actually closing down businesses that were relying on migrant labor, and burning those relationships with our neighbors as well.
And is there a financial benefit from this situation? I mean, if you look around, let's take transport as one example. Where did we suddenly find this additional capacity to be able to move people? Which bus companies are making money out of that? And there's more. There's accommodation, there's processing, there's security. It seems to me, you could even almost say there's an industry that's now mushrooming around this issue.
Absolutely, and I think that's the key question. We should be asking how a government has run an operation of this scale outside its own legal and financial framework and is calling it successful policy. Who got those contracts? The largest portion of 292 million went on transport, as you say, procured under emergency conditions, which were outside the normal legislative framework. And if we look at South Africa's track record, in dealing with procurements during emergencies such as the pandemic, that is not a great track record. And Parliament has not been asking those questions of, where that money has come from, who got the contracts, and how this was, were those contracts publicly tendered? I mean, those are all really important questions, and they all point to the fact that this money has been thrown at a crisis that we manufactured to perform this idea of, migration management, when actually all we've done, is make the situation much worse and not really, address the underlying conditions, which ultimately we know are about unemployment, poverty, poor service delivery, none of which removing migrants is going to fix.
There's been some umbrage taken by officials from our side, particularly at the governments of our neighbors and even perhaps further afield, almost as if we're being picked on. The framing of this issue is unfair, the argument has gone. And now we've even made requests to several governments for reimbursements for the repatriation. Is that something that we just say almost to satisfy those who would be baying for blood because, of course, of these unbudgeted for expenses? I mean, is it realistic to expect that any of these countries will pay us a red cent?
Well, if we look at it, for example, from, say, Malawi's perspective, Malawi has a GDP per capita of roughly $600 compared to South Africa's 6,000. So we're asking one of the world's poorest countries to reimburse us for moving its citizens, many of whom were sending remittances home, keeping their families going, that were actually contributing to the South African economy, bringing skills, sharing skills, and now we're asking them to foot the bill for returning those people. And in addition to that, South Africa holds the SADC chairmanship, and we've committed to using that platform to address regional migration, to make regional migration work better. So you can't claim that you're working on that, and you're trying to build relationships. And also part of the government's 5-point migration plan was to, build better relationships with our neighbors. So you can't claim to do that and then the next day send them an invoice for, something that we have actually created ourselves. So, there's not only this sort of basic sort of arithmetic there, but there's also the moral matter as well. South Africa has received enormous continental solidarity throughout its history. And those, surrounding countries particularly hosted, people crossed over and sought sanctuary in our neighboring countries, in Tanzania, Zambia, Mozambique for decades. At no cost to us, those countries, looked after South Africans. Nobody sent South Africa an invoice for that. So, to look at it that way, you've really got to ask, what is the logic here? This is not going to be paid via an invoice, but more importantly is what is this doing to our relationships and how does this make South Africa look?
It's meant to be a political sleight of hand, but I'm afraid we might pay the price in more ways than we are seeing right now. Dr. Rebecca Walker is a senior research consultant at the Africa Center for Migration and Society at Wits University.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
Your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.